Every great financial system begins with a promise of stability, fairness, and opportunity. But what if the modern financial system, the one you trust with your savings, your investments, and your future, was built on the same structure as a pyramid scheme? Not in name, but in design. Stay with me, because once you see the pattern, you'll never unsee it. Before we dive deeper, I'd love to know, which country are you watching this from? And what time is it right now where you are? I'm asking because finance looks different depending on where you stand, and I want to see how global this conversation truly is. Now let's break it down together. At the heart of any pyramid scheme lies a simple rule. The system only survives if more people keep entering. Old promises are paid with new money. And if the flow stops, everything collapses. Sound familiar? Because in modern finance, that rule isn't the exception. It's the foundation. Governments issue debt to pay old debt. Banks create money that didn't exist before. Investors chase yield, not because of value, but because standing still means losing purchasing power. Everyone in the chain needs someone below them to keep buying in, and that's not an accident. Let's start with the origin. In a traditional pyramid scheme, you recruit participants. Each one brings in money, expecting returns that come from newer recruits. But in the global economy, central banks and governments play the same role. They issue bonds, promises of future payment. Those bonds are bought with newly created money. The public funds the system through savings, taxes, and pensions. Every cycle depends on belief. Belief that the next generation will buy the debt, that the next investor will pay a higher price, that the system will always expand. Now look at money creation. In the modern world, 97% of money exists as credit. Loans created by banks when someone signs a contract. No loan, no money. Every dollar in your account is someone else's debt. That means the system must keep expanding. If people stop borrowing, money supply shrinks, economies slow down, defaults rise. The solution? Encourage more borrowing, lower interest rates, promise growth. Sound familiar? That's how the illusion stays alive. As long as more participants join, the pyramid holds. But there's a catch. Unlike a scammer's pyramid, this one is legal. In fact, it's celebrated. Financial news calls it monetary stimulus. Governments call it fiscal responsibility. Investors call it liquidity. But behind the labels, the structure remains the same. Everyone at the top, the lenders, the asset owners, the policymakers, depends on everyone below continuing to believe. If belief fades, confidence breaks. And when confidence breaks, the whole system trembles. This is why debt never goes away. Global debt crossed $300 trillion. That's nearly 4 times the size of the entire global economy. It's mathematically impossible to repay without collapsing demand. So what do? We refinance, we issue more, we push the burden forward. Each generation inherits the liabilities of the last, just like the late entrants in a pyramid inherit the risk. It's not fraud by law, but by logic, it's unsustainable. Now, let's talk incentives. In a pyramid, the earliest entrants profit. They get in cheap, take profits, and leave before collapse. In modern finance, the early entrants are the asset owners. The top 10% hold over 80% of global wealth. Why? Because they own claims, stocks, bonds, real estate, that rise when new money flows in. The more liquidity central banks inject, the higher those assets climb. The working class sees nominal growth but loses purchasing power. It's the same dynamic. The first ones in extract value, while the last ones hold the bag. And yet, we're told this is normal. We're told markets always go up. We're told debt is manageable. But in truth, those sayings are confidence tricks. They keep the game running. They make you believe there's no alternative. The irony is, even regulators and politicians know the fragility. But as long as the music plays, no one dares stop dancing. The alternative, a reset, is politically suicidal. So, like any pyramid, it grows until it can't. You might ask, if this is so fragile, why hasn't it collapsed yet? Because pyramids are designed to last as long as belief does. The system has tools, interest rates, bailouts, quantitative easing, to postpone reckoning. But each rescue requires more intervention. The Fed's balance sheet went from under $1 trillion to over $8 trillion in 2 decades. Every crisis demands a bigger fix, and every fix raises the stakes. Think back to 2008. A credit pyramid built on subprime loans collapsed. The response? Create even more credit at lower rates to prevent collapse. In 2020, global shutdowns triggered panic. The solution? Print trillions. Those moves didn't solve the problem. They inflated a larger one. Asset prices soared, inequality widened, and dependency deepened. Each solution builds the next layer of the pyramid. If the system depends on endless growth, then it's trapped by its own design. Real productivity can't grow exponentially, but credit can. So the gap between financial claims and real value widens. That's why you see markets boom while wages stagnate. Why housing becomes unaffordable. Why every crisis hits the bottom harder than the top. The structure rewards leverage, not labor. So what happens when belief runs out? Look to history. Every major monetary regime, gold standards, silver coins, Bretton Woods, fixed pegs, eventually broke under the weight of promises that couldn't be kept. The difference today is scale. Our system is global, digital, and tightly connected. A loss of trust in one major currency can ripple through the entire network in days. That's why governments scramble to maintain confidence through guarantees, backstops, and carefully crafted words. They know psychology is policy, and you're part of it. Every time you save in a currency, buy a bond, or trust a pension, you're reinforcing belief. But belief without sustainability is fragile. The question isn't whether the system is legal, it's whether it's stable. And if a structure needs infinite growth to survive, how long before the base collapses under its own weight? That's the real danger of modern finance. It's not theft, it's dependence on expansion, on credit, on faith. And like every pyramid, once expansion slows, truth catches up. Would you call this sustainable? Or does it sound like a legalized pyramid scheme built in plain sight? Tell me below what you think. Because once you see this structure, the illusion of safety starts to fade. To understand how this structure became normalized, we have to look at how laws and institutions quietly reshape the meaning of value itself. Once upon a time, money represented real goods, gold, silver, labor. You worked, earned, and exchanged. There was a limit. Then came the shift. Credit became money. That meant anyone with authority could expand the system without producing anything tangible. The moment governments untied money from metal, they gained infinite leverage. They could issue promises without backing. And with every promise came control. Control over interest rates, inflation, and purchasing power. This is where the pyramid turned from economic model to political tool. In the modern system, every layer depends on confidence in the layer above it. Citizens trust banks. Banks trust central banks. Central banks trust governments. Governments trust the bond market. But the bond market only trusts growth. Remove growth, and the chain snaps. That's why every political cycle becomes an economic race. Whoever delivers higher GDP wins confidence. But GDP isn't wealth, it's activity. You can inflate GDP by borrowing and spending, yet produce no long-term value. That's how illusions become statistics. And statistics become proof that the scheme still works. Consider this. Since 1971, global GDP has grown nearly 40 times. Global debt has grown over 100 times. That means each new dollar of growth requires more and more borrowing. This isn't prosperity, it's leverage. And the ones closest to the source of new credit benefit first. When a central bank injects liquidity, it doesn't flow evenly. It moves through banks, hedge funds, and corporations before it reaches wages. By the time it trickles down, prices have already adjusted. So the working class pays more for the same goods, while asset owners gain on inflated prices. That's not a side effect. That's the design. This cycle creates a powerful illusion. Wealth expansion. Asset prices rise, 401ks look healthy, home equity grows, but beneath the surface, every gain is a claim on future labor. Someone, somewhere, will have to pay the interest, the taxes, the inflation. When too many claims exist relative to real value, history calls it a bubble. When the whole system operates that way, it's something larger, a systemic pyramid where belief replaces productivity. Let's bring this closer to reality. Take pensions. They promise retirees future payments based on projected returns. Those returns depend on markets growing indefinitely. But what if growth slows? Funds can't meet obligations. The only fix is to inject more, through money printing, government debt, or reduced benefits. Again, the top of the pyramid gets paid with resources from below. The system demands participation. You don't opt in, you're born into it. Your taxes, savings, and labor feed its expansion. This design also explains why crises never resolve. They roll forward. Every downturn creates victims at the base. The top issues new promises to stabilize the structure. That stabilization inflates the next bubble. Think of 2000. Tech stocks crashed. The solution? Lower rates. That fueled housing. Housing crashed in 2008. The solution? Bailouts and zero interest. That inflated sovereign debt. Now we face the next layer. Governments themselves are overextended. If the lender of last resort needs rescuing, who rescues them? In every pyramid, transparency is the enemy. If participants knew the structure's limits, they'd withdraw. So the system must maintain complexity. Financial jargon, derivative products, regulatory fog, all serve one purpose: to hide the fragility. Terms like quantitative easing, liquidity operations, or macroprudential policy sound sophisticated, but they mask a simple truth. We are printing money to pay old obligations. The sophistication is the camouflage. Now, you might think, if this system is so fragile, why do experts defend it? Because every position of power in finance is built on this structure. Central bankers, Policymakers and asset managers owe their authority to their ability to manage belief. They can't admit the truth, because confidence is currency. The moment people stop believing, control evaporates. That's why every crisis response emphasizes stability. The fundamentals are strong. The system is resilient. These phrases aren't analysis, they're incantations to preserve faith. Let's look at an example. When banks fail, governments guarantee deposits. But where does the guarantee come from? From taxpayers, the same base of the pyramid. When nations overborrow, central banks buy their bonds. But where do central banks get money? They create it. When inflation rises, wages lag behind. Workers demand raises, prices rise again, and purchasing power erodes. Each fix creates a new imbalance. This is why the system feels permanently unstable, because its equilibrium depends on imbalance. The truth is uncomfortable. The modern financial order needs inequality to function. If everyone held assets, inflation would destroy capital values. If no one held debt, money creation would stall. So the structure requires a majority of debtors and a minority of asset owners. This is the hidden architecture of what people call capitalism. But at its core, it's creditism. Growth by borrowing, profit by lending, power by issuing. Some argue this system can last forever because it's backed by law, not by math. But history disagrees. Every paper money regime has eventually reached a point where expansion outruns trust. At that moment, governments choose between default and devaluation. They rarely default. They inflate. Inflation is the silent collapse, the polite end of every pyramid. It doesn't announce itself. It erodes quietly. A currency buys less. A wage stretches thinner. Savings vanish. Yet the numbers on the screen still rise, giving the illusion of stability. That's why every generation thinks their system is unique. They say, ours is smarter. We have data, models, technology. But physics doesn't change. You can't expand claims forever without real backing. Whether it's gold, goods, or energy, real value must anchor the system. When claims outnumber anchors, correction follows. Sometimes it's fast, like a market crash. Sometimes slow, like a century of creeping inflation. But the outcome is always transfer, from late participants to early ones. So ask yourself, who benefits when money loses meaning? The answer is consistent. Those with real assets, land, commodities, influence, survive transitions. Those with paper claims suffer. That's not opinion, it's a pattern. From Rome's debased silver to Weimar's marks to modern fiat, collapse always redistributes wealth upward before resetting the game. Now, some will say this comparison is unfair. They'll argue that modern finance funds innovation, infrastructure, opportunity, and to some extent, it does. But those benefits rely on constant expansion. When credit stops, the system seizes. That's not resilience, that's dependency. A healthy economy creates value first, then money. Ours creates money first and hopes value follows. Every pyramid thrives on optimism. As long as you believe you'll move up, you'll stay in. But statistically, most don't. Only the top extracts. The rest maintain. And maintaining requires faith. That's why you're told the system works. That's why dissent is labeled ignorance. Because doubt is dangerous. It invites withdrawal. If you think this is theory, look at the numbers. In 1980, $1 bought nearly 5 times more real goods than today. Median wages adjusted for inflation have barely moved in 50 years. But asset prices have multiplied tenfold. That's not natural progress. That's engineered imbalance. So when we call the system a legal pyramid, it's not metaphor. It's structural description. A base funds a peak, promises expand faster than proof, and participation is mandatory. The question isn't whether it will end. The question is how, through managed devaluation, debt write-offs, or full reset. But resets come with pain. That's why authorities delay them, using every policy trick available. Every delay increases tension, and tension always finds release. Would you trust a structure that must grow forever to survive? Or would you start preparing for what happens when belief runs thin? Let's step into the future, because understanding where the system goes next is just as important as knowing how it began. Every financial pyramid eventually faces the same test. What happens when expansion stops? We're already seeing the early signals. Interest rates rising after a decade near zero, debt loads reaching historic highs, growth slowing across developed nations, confidence beginning to erode. These aren't isolated trends. They're symptoms of a structure nearing its limits. The math no longer works. Each new dollar of debt produces less output, less employment, less wealth creation. The system isn't failing because of one bad actor. It's failing because the design requires infinite fuel in a finite world. When the 2008 crisis hit, policymakers swore they would reform the system. Instead, they amplified it. The playbook never changes. Cut rates, print money, buy assets. The medicine became the disease. Now, after 2 decades of intervention, central banks hold trillions in bonds. Governments rely on debt to fund even basic operations. Households depend on credit to maintain living standards. And corporations borrow to buy back their own shares, not to innovate. This is not capitalism. It's a credit bubble with a marketing team. The next stage is digital. Central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs, are being tested worldwide. Officials sell them as efficiency upgrades, but their real function is control. If money becomes fully programmable, every transaction can be tracked, taxed, and timed. Expiration dates, spending limits, targeted stimulus, all possible. In a collapsing pyramid, control replaces trust. When confidence fades, coercion fills the gap. CBDCs give the architects a switchboard for the entire base. And once behavior becomes code, participation becomes mandatory in a new way. You won't withdraw, you'll comply. That's not theory, it's preparation. Over 130 countries are researching or piloting digital currencies. China already runs trials. The European Central Bank plans its digital euro. The United States studies design options. These programs promise safety but demand surrender. Your privacy for their precision. Why does this matter? Because when the structure trembles, the instinct of those at the top is not reform, but reinforcement. They'll tighten the system, not open it. We've seen this pattern before. In every late-stage pyramid, elites rewrite the rules to buy time. In Rome, emperors clipped coins. In France, the monarchy debased assignats. In modern times, interest rates turn negative, savers are penalized, and inflation erodes the middle silently. When traditional tools lose effect, innovation becomes necessity. That's why talk of reset has grown louder. The IMF calls for restructuring. The World Economic Forum speaks of great resets. These aren't conspiracies, they're coded admissions. The system can't sustain itself without rewriting obligations. Someone's claim must vanish. The only question is whose. Think about what happens when a pyramid reaches saturation. Everyone's in. No new participants remain. That's our economy today. Everyone borrows. Governments, corporations, households. The next layer doesn't exist. So policymakers look outward. Immigration, globalization, assetization of everything from water to data. Anything to expand the base. But each expansion adds fragility. Globalization ties systems together. A shock in one node ripples through all. The same leverage that creates prosperity multiplies risk. In this late stage, narratives become vital. You're told inflation is temporary. You're told deficits don't matter. You're told technology will save productivity. These stories maintain participation, but stories can't outlast math. And math says compounding debt and stagnant real output end in one of three outcomes: inflation, austerity, or default. Inflation steals quietly. Austerity breaks politically. Default resets violently. There's no painless option. Yet most people remain unaware. They measure wealth in digits, not in purchasing power. They celebrate rising asset values without seeing the denominator fall. The deception is elegant. If your house price doubles, but your grocery bill doubles too, you've gained nothing. But the illusion keeps you calm. Calm participants don't revolt. They comply. That's why this system thrives on psychological management. Economists call it expectations policy. Central banks don't just set rates, they shape perception. Because in a confidence-based system, perception is reality. So what can you do inside a structure like this? You can't dismantle it alone, but you can step sideways. Real assets, energy, food, skills, networks, hold value when paper promises fail. Every historical transition rewarded those who understood real versus nominal wealth. In Weimar Germany, gold owners survived. In the Soviet collapse, those with trade goods thrived. In Argentina, hard currency kept families afloat. History doesn't repeat perfectly, but patterns rhyme. This is not about fear, it's about awareness. If you understand the mechanism, you stop feeding it blindly. You question easy narratives. You track purchasing power, not price charts. You realize growth based on debt is borrowed time. And once enough people see it, change becomes possible. Because a pyramid collapses, not when the top fails, but when the base stops believing. The next decade will test belief more than any period in modern finance. Aging populations will strain pensions. Rising rates will stress governments. Digital currencies will reshape money's meaning. Trust, once lost, doesn't return easily. When people no longer believe in tomorrow's promises, they demand value today. That's when velocity rises, savings fall, and systems crack. We're already near that threshold. So where does this leave you? You can stay inside, hoping managers can engineer endless expansion. Or you can prepare for contraction, mentally, financially, and socially. Learn history, study balance sheets, understand that no structure grows forever. Every system reaches scale. Every promise meets reality. Modern finance is not evil, it's exhausted. Its logic worked in a world of expansion. In a world of limits, it falters. The final stage of any pyramid looks calmest before it breaks. Numbers rise fastest. Confidence feels strongest. But under the surface, Pressure builds. You won't see the end in headlines, you'll feel it in shrinking paychecks, rising costs, and leaders assuring you everything's fine. That's how every illusion fades. Slowly at first, then all at once. So ask yourself one final question. If modern finance depends on constant growth, what happens when growth ends? Who bears the weight